America's beloved Family Feud host stepped into the intense world of daytime television expecting friendly conversation, only to find himself confronting one of the most polarizing personalities in talk show history. What unfolded was a dramatic clash that quickly spiraled from lighthearted banter into a heated verbal showdown, leaving producers on edge, the studio audience stunned, and a legendary entertainer pushed to his limits. What was meant to be a simple promotional visit became one of the most talked about moments on daytime TV. Steve Harvey had arrived at the studio riding high on the success of his many projects. Between hosting hit television shows, writing books, and preparing for an upcoming comedy special, his career was thriving. His appearance on The View was scheduled as a relaxed discussion about his latest work, sprinkled with humor and the relationship insights he had become famous for. The morning began smoothly, with Steve greeting staff members warmly, joking with crew, and settling into the familiar rhythm of a television set he had visited many times before. Producers had emphasized that the segment should remain upbeat and entertaining, a chance for Steve to charm the audience and promote his projects. As he took his seat at the table, dressed sharply and wearing his trademark confident smile, the energy initially felt welcoming. Whoopi Goldberg guided the show with her usual calm presence, introducing Steve with genuine enthusiasm. The audience responded with loud applause, clearly excited to see the comedian and host they had grown to love. Steve greeted each co-host warmly, saving Joy Behar for last. Even during that brief exchange, there was a noticeable stiffness in her body language, something Steve registered but chose to ignore. He assumed it was nothing more than pre-show tension. The conversation began exactly as planned. Steve spoke about balancing multiple television ventures, shared amusing behind-the-scenes stories from Family Feud, and talked about his comedy tour. His natural charisma filled the room, drawing laughter and applause from the audience. For several minutes, everything flowed effortlessly. The segment felt like classic daytime television, light, humorous, and engaging. Then the tone shifted. Joy Behar abruptly redirected the discussion, her voice sharper than before. She brought up Steve's history of giving relationship advice and contrasted it with his personal life, pointing out his multiple marriages. The studio atmosphere changed instantly. Laughter faded, replaced by an uneasy silence that settled over the set. Steve's smile faltered briefly before he regained his composure, but the warmth of the moment was gone. Steve responded calmly, explaining that his life experiences, including his mistakes, were precisely what allowed him to offer meaningful advice. He spoke about learning from failure and using those lessons to help others avoid similar struggles. He made it clear that he never claimed perfection, only honesty and growth. His tone remained measured, though a subtle firmness had entered his voice. Joy pressed on, suggesting that it was convenient for him to profit from relationship advice despite what she described as a complicated personal history. She emphasized the number of his marriages, implying that such a record undermined his credibility. The other co-hosts shifted uncomfortably in their seats, exchanging glances as they sensed the conversation drifting into uncomfortable territory. It was clear this was not where anyone expected the segment to go. Steve remained professional, though his jaw tightened slightly. He explained that he never hid his past and believed transparency made his guidance more authentic. He described himself not as a detached expert, but as someone who had lived through the highs and lows of love and commitment. His words carried the weight of lived experience rather than theory, and he emphasized that real understanding often comes from failure as much as success. Joy continued to push, framing his experiences as more of a warning than a qualification. Her remarks grew increasingly pointed, and the audience began to murmur. The playful energy that usually defined Steve Harvey's appearances had vanished, replaced by tension and discomfort. This was no longer entertainment but a public examination of his personal life. Leaning forward slightly, Steve kept his voice steady, but the firmness was unmistakable. He made it clear that growth often comes through repeated effort, not instant success. He spoke about resilience, accountability, and the value of learning hard lessons. His response was controlled, yet carried an emotional undercurrent that revealed how deeply personal the exchange had become. By this point, the studio felt divided. Some audience members nodded in agreement with Steve's words, while others watched in stunned silence. Producers monitored the situation closely, aware that the segment had veered far from its intended course. What was meant to be a light promotional interview had transformed into a raw and uncomfortable confrontation, exposing the fine line between tough conversation and personal attack. The clash underscored the unpredictable nature of live television, where a single shift in tone can change everything. Steve Harvey, known for humor and warmth, found himself defending his life choices instead of promoting his work. Joy Behar, unrelenting in her approach, had turned the spotlight into an interrogation. The moment lingered in the air, heavy and unresolved, as the show moved forward under a cloud of tension. Joy, what you're doing in this moment is exactly the kind of hostility that poisons real conversations and damages genuine connection. You're taking someone's openness and personal truth and trying to turn it into ammunition. That isn't journalism, and it certainly isn't constructive. It's simply cruel. By now, the tension in the studio was impossible to ignore. It hung thick in the air, pressing down on everyone present. Joy's eyes flickered with something that looked disturbingly close to satisfaction, as though she had achieved exactly what she intended. Rather than easing up or acknowledging that she may have gone too far, she pushed harder. Cruel. Joy let out a sharp laugh, empty of warmth. Steve, I'm asking valid questions that our viewers deserve answers to. You've positioned yourself as a relationship expert. You make money giving advice. You publish books telling people how to find love and keep it. It's reasonable to take a closer look at your credibility. Steve's calm exterior was beginning to fracture, though he fought to keep his tone steady and professional. My credibility comes from lived experience, he said. From what I've done right and what I've done wrong. But what you're doing doesn't feel like journalism. It feels like someone taking pleasure in tearing another person apart. Joy waved him off with a dismissive gesture, scoffing at the suggestion. Don't try to paint me as the bad guy because I'm asking uncomfortable questions. This is what happens on this show. We don't just sit quietly and let guests repeat rehearsed talking points. Sensing the situation slipping further out of control, Whoopi attempted to step in, suggesting they pivot back to discussing Steve's comedy special, which she noted had been getting great reactions. Joy cut her off without hesitation. No, this matters. Steve has built an empire telling people how to live their lives, and the audience deserves to know whether they should trust advice from someone who struggled with the very issues he profits from now. Steve's hands tightened in his lap, his knuckles turning pale. When he spoke again, his voice was controlled but strained, the effort behind that control clearly visible. If we're measuring qualifications by personal history, then let's be consistent. Everyone at this table has had relationships. Everyone has given advice to friends. If we're going to dissect track records, then no one here is exempt. Joy snapped back immediately, clearly uncomfortable with the focus shifting toward her. This isn't about me. I'm not the one selling advice to millions. No, you're the one publicly trying to tear someone down on national television, Steve replied, his voice rising just enough to signal his breaking patience. And for what reason? What's the goal here? The other co-hosts shifted uneasily, their discomfort obvious as they glanced toward the producers, silently hoping someone would intervene. The audience reacted as well, some visibly upset by Joy's treatment of Steve Harvey, others simply unsettled by the escalating hostility that had hijacked the segment. Joy leaned forward, her tone sharpening even further. What I'm doing is honest journalism. Something that seems to be missing when celebrities come on television expecting nothing but praise and easy questions. Steve echoed her words slowly, disbelief woven into his voice. Honest journalism. Is that what this is supposed to be? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like someone projecting their own frustrations onto a guest who showed up in good faith for a conversation. The word hung in the air, heavy and explosive. The studio went silent, the low hum of cameras suddenly the only sound. Joy's face flushed as anger flashed across her features. Bitter, she repeated quietly. Did you really just call me bitter? Steve understood he had crossed a line, but instead of retreating, he pressed forward. If the label fits, you've been coming at me since the moment this conversation turned. All because I've been married more than once. Because I've made mistakes. There's something deeper going on here, and it has nothing to do with journalism. Joy's composure finally collapsed. Her voice rose, sharp and emotional. You want to know what's really happening? I'm sick of men like you building fortunes by exploiting women's insecurities while your own lives are in chaos. You sell books telling women how to think, how to behave, how to mold themselves into some formula just to keep a man. You reduce complex human beings into instructions and call it advice. Steve shot back instantly, his voice now matching her intensity. Don't twist what I do. I help people. I help families. I share what I've learned so others don't have to stumble blindly through the same mistakes. I don't shame anyone, and I don't exploit anyone. What I do comes from experience, not manipulation. The room felt fractured, divided between outrage, discomfort, and disbelief. What had begun as a routine daytime interview had fully unraveled into a raw confrontation, exposing deep resentment, clashing worldviews, and emotions neither side was willing to soften. The easy laughter, the planned promotion, and the friendly tone were long gone, replaced by a moment that would linger long after the cameras stopped rolling. I bring people hope, humor, and sometimes guidance drawn from my own life experiences. That is what I offer the world. What you're offering right now is nothing but hostility and destruction, tearing people apart for entertainment. The studio instantly erupted into noise and confusion. Applause broke out from one side of the audience in support of Steve, while loud boos rose from the other directed at Joy. The atmosphere spiraled into complete disorder. Off camera, producers waved their arms frantically, urging the hosts to regain control as the segment slipped further into chaos. Joy shot up from her chair, her entire body trembling with anger. Her voice shook as she shouted that her contribution was exposing frauds who exploit people's pain for personal gain. She accused Steve of being nothing more than a polished con artist, dressing manipulation in charm and selling false hope for profit. Steve rose to his feet as well, towering over her, his expression hardened with fury. He fired back that she was driven by bitterness and resentment toward anyone who succeeded, insisting that her attack had nothing to do with journalism and everything to do with unresolved personal frustrations. Joy screamed that she would not tolerate being psychoanalyzed on her own program. Steve responded with a harsh laugh, pointing out that the show belonged to everyone at the table and not to her alone. He suggested that her need to dominate every discussion revealed the real issue, a belief that her opinions were the center of the universe. Whoopi desperately attempted to restore order, urging everyone to pause and breathe, but her voice was drowned out by the escalating confrontation. Joy was not finished. She announced that if personal matters were on the table, then Steve's behavior behind the scenes deserved scrutiny. She claimed she had heard stories about how he treated his staff when cameras were not rolling, suggesting hypocrisy between his public image and private conduct. The room froze. Steve's face drained of color before flushing red with rage. He demanded clarity, his voice sharp and shaking. Joy replied coldly, implying that viewers might be interested in seeing the real man rather than the carefully curated persona presented on television. Silence swept across the studio. Whatever Joy was insinuating, it was clear she had escalated the conflict to a dangerous level. Steve's hands trembled at his sides, and for a moment it seemed as though he might completely lose control. When he finally spoke, his voice was tightly restrained, brimming with barely contained fury. He warned her that reckless accusations carried serious weight. Attacks on his personal life or professional credentials were one thing, but suggesting misconduct without facts or evidence crossed a line. He stated flatly that such behavior was not journalism but outright dishonesty. Joy's eyes burned with defiance as she threw the accusation back at him. She mocked the image he projected, ridiculing the idea of him as a moral authority or model family man. She dismissed his career as an act built on illusion. Steve snapped back just as forcefully, declaring that he had never portrayed himself as flawless. He emphasized that he had always been transparent about his failures, his growth, and his struggles. What angered him was her use of a personal vendetta disguised as media responsibility, a practice he argued was poisoning modern discourse. He accused her of prioritizing character assassination over truth and understanding. The remaining co-hosts fell silent, abandoning any attempt to intervene. They sat frozen as two seasoned television figures dismantled each other on live broadcast. The audience was sharply divided, some cheering Steve's defiance, others backing Joy's aggression, all transfixed by the astonishing breakdown unfolding before them. Joy released a bitter laugh, insisting she had no personal grudge. She claimed her motivation was purely professional, rooted in the duty to ask difficult questions others avoided. Steve responded with disbelief, stating there was nothing professional about what had just occurred. He described the exchange as deeply personal and openly hostile, acknowledging that both of them knew it. For the first time since the confrontation began, Joy hesitated. A flicker of uncertainty crossed her face before she quickly masked it with renewed intensity. She declared that Steve symbolized something she found disturbing, the idea that fame alone could transform anyone into an expert regardless of qualifications. Steve answered immediately, saying she embodied something equally troubling, a culture that thrived on negativity and destruction rather than growth and encouragement. He accused her of promoting the belief that cruelty equaled intelligence and that tearing people down was somehow insightful. The tension in the studio became suffocating, thick enough to feel physical. Cameras continued rolling, capturing every raw second of the collapse in broadcast decorum. Production assistants stood motionless, unsure whether to interrupt or allow the spectacle to continue. Joy straightened her posture, lifting her chin as her voice rose once more, fully committed to the confrontation as the moment reached its breaking point. "You know what, Steve, I think our audience can finally see who you really are. All that charm, all that down-home wisdom you sell, it vanishes the second someone challenges you. The man standing here now isn't the smiling TV host. It's someone angry, defensive, and lashing out at a woman on live television." Steve stared at her in disbelief. "Attacking a woman, that's what you're going with now. You've been coming after me since the moment I sat down. You questioned my character, my integrity, my credibility, and now you're trying to paint yourself as the victim." "That's unbelievable." Joy fired back that she wasn't playing the victim at all. She said she was simply pointing out that the man who writes books about how men should treat women was now raising his voice at a woman on national television. Steve corrected her immediately, his voice booming across the studio. He said he was responding to a person who had been attacking him nonstop. He made it clear that gender had nothing to do with it, that the issue was her behavior, her lack of professionalism, and the unnecessary cruelty she had shown from the start. Whoopi finally tried to step in, her voice unsteady as she urged both of them to pause and calm down. But Steve was finished engaging at the table. He turned toward the audience, his tone shifting to a mix of anger and disappointment. He explained that he came there to talk about his work, to make people laugh, and to share lessons from his life. Instead, he found himself in an environment where tearing someone down seemed to matter more than having a real conversation. Joy wasn't ready to let it end there. She snapped back that what Steve encountered was someone willing to ask hard questions rather than simply hand him a platform to sell his products. Steve turned back toward her, his voice now controlled and icy. He said the exchange had been revealing, not about him, but about her. It showed the audience exactly the kind of atmosphere she fostered on the show. He added that he genuinely felt sorry for her co-hosts, who had to navigate that level of hostility on a daily basis. The comment hit Joy hard. Her face flushed deeper red, and for a moment she was at a loss for words. When she finally spoke, her voice trembled with anger as she accused him of coming onto her show and insulting both her and her colleagues. Steve replied calmly that he hadn't insulted the co-hosts at all. He said he expressed sympathy for them, and there was a difference. As for Joy, he pointed out that he hadn't said anything she hadn't already demonstrated herself through her conduct over the past several minutes. The studio fell into silence once again. Steve's words lingered heavily in the air as Joy seemed to process what had just happened. She had pushed relentlessly, trying to provoke him into losing control, and now that she had succeeded, she appeared uncertain about how to regain footing. Steve scanned the room, taking in the uneasy expressions of the other hosts and the sharply divided audience before returning his gaze to Joy. He then said quietly that he was done. This wasn't the conversation he came to have, and it wasn't the kind of television that helped anyone. With that, he reached up and began removing his microphone. The gesture sent shockwaves through the studio. Guests didn't simply walk off this show, and certainly not in the middle of a live broadcast. Joy seemed to realize in that moment how far things had gone. She called out for him to wait, suggesting he didn't have to leave. Steve raised his hand to stop her. He said that he did have to leave, because maintaining his dignity and principles mattered, even when others chose not to do the same. He wished her and the audience well but made it clear he would not participate in whatever the segment had turned into. As he stood and walked toward the exit, the studio erupted. Some audience members jumped to their feet applauding him, while others booed loudly in Joy's direction. The remaining co-hosts sat frozen, unsure how to respond to a situation no one had anticipated. Steve paused at the edge of the set and turned back one final time. He addressed the viewers watching at home, reminding them that life was too short to spend tearing one another down. He spoke about the importance of building each other up, offering support, and encouraging growth, saying that this was what real wisdom looked like. With that, he exited the set, leaving behind one of the most explosive moments daytime television had seen in years. Joy Behar remained seated, completely silent, an unusual sight for a veteran host known for always having the last word. As the reality of what had just unfolded settled in, the cameras continued rolling, capturing the stunned audience, the fractured energy in the room, and Joy's expression as she realized her aggressive approach had backfired. What was meant to be a simple promotional appearance had transformed into a defining moment for everyone involved, one that neither side had planned and no one watching would soon forget.